All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. My name is Tara Masick, and I am the program director of the Mental Health Professional Partnership Program at the ESU2, which is located in Fremont. We serve 16 school districts in Nebraska. A little bit about my history. I'm a clinical social worker by training. And I have worked in the school setting for over the last 20 years as a behavior interventionist, a school social worker. I've been in the role of school counselor. I've also worked as a therapist for a child advocacy center. And then the last few years more in administration in terms of building best practices in school mental health and helping school districts support some of those efforts. So I'm excited to be here today to talk a little bit about behavior. When we were trying to figure out exactly where to go with this training, I always end up coming back to behavior from a trauma-informed lens. And I think a lot of that comes down to brain development. So that's what we're going to spend some time talking about today. Feel free to ask questions. This is meant to be very laid back. I would love to hear your experiences and questions as we go through. So don't hesitate to unmute yourself and ask any questions. Otherwise, I'll leave some time at the end to ask some questions if anybody has questions there as well. I'm going to give you a minute to take a look at the quote that's up on this slide. I love this quote because I think it's a really good example of the things that we see from our students on a daily basis. And we're here today. It's really all about decoding behavior and influencing our emotional contagion in the way that we want to help students be successful. So, and I know you guys have had some trauma-informed care trainings, and I watched them myself. They were great. And really the purpose of trauma-informed care is to really look at the root of the problem rather than just the symptoms. And if we don't acknowledge that trauma is common and that students who are responding out of a crisis functioning, we can't do anything about it if we don't recognize that it's there. So trauma and behavior is based on the idea that much of student misbehavior is a result of a brain that has been overwhelmed by repeated traumatic experiences. Our goal today is to gain a basic understanding of trauma and its impact on brain development and behavior, and then explore some strategies for supporting and connecting with our challenging students who may have a history of trauma or who just in general are acting out of that survival brain. So to get started, we're going to watch a short video that helps us to really see the differences in student interactions in the classroom based on whether they're in the learning brain or survival mode.
A learning brain versus a brain in survival mode. So we'll just call it learning brain versus survival brain. And this is the difference. So learning brain is this brain that's open to learning new information, and it's completely okay with ambiguity and grays and vagueness, and it sees the big picture. It like pulls back and is on the balcony, can look over the forest and figure out what's going on. On an emotional level, people in learning brain feel calm, peaceful, maybe a little excited about what they're about to learn, maybe a little playful and having fun too, and definitely curious. And they're not afraid of making mistakes because it's just part of the learning process. And so they're not really thinking about themselves. And they actually feel a little bit of confidence that if they just apply themselves, they might pick up what they're trying to learn. Now, survival brain, on the other hand, is completely different. It's hyper-focused on threat. It doesn't like ambiguity. It wants clear, hard facts. It thinks in black and white terms. It doesn't want anything to be gray at all. And then emotionally, you can imagine that survival brain makes people feel panicky, feel like a little obsessive and afraid of getting things wrong. And they don't feel calm and open to learning new things. They just want to get things over with. And people in survival brain also really don't like making mistakes, and they are afraid of looking stupid too. So students in survival brain don't want to be picked on. They don't want to raise their hand and ask questions and look stupid. And so these people are also filled with doubt about their own ability to learn stuff, and they're afraid that other people can see how stupid they really are. Now, it's really important to understand how learning brain and survival brain interact, because survival brain always trumps learning brain. And it makes sense, because survival brain is just trying to save your life. And so if it thinks that there's something dangerous happening, you better pay attention to it, right? But the tricky thing is that as survival brain stays on longer and longer, it's harder to get out of that. And it's harder to really go into learning brain. And the way I think about it is kind of like the myth of Sisyphus. You know, that guy who has to push a rock up a hill, and then every day it falls back down and he has to do it over and over again. Well, being in learning brain is like being up on the high parts of that mountain. You can see the expanse of what's going on, but it also takes a lot of work to be up there. And at any second, if you're not paying attention and putting effort into it, it's so easy to slip back into survival brain again. And that rock that Sisyphus is trying to push up, well, that's kind of like stress. And the more stressed you feel, the heavier and bigger that rock gets, and it just pushes you back into survival brain quicker. Now, the kicker is that for traumatized people, stress is a really rigid and intense thing. And so with trauma, any little stress makes that rock grow way bigger than it normally would. And because people with trauma misperceive ambiguous situations as threatening and stressful, that rock just stays big all the time. Now, the good news is that the more you control stress, well, the easier it is to be in learning brain, right? Because that rock is a lot smaller. And what I really want to highlight for teachers is that the best way to keep students in learning brain goes back to why I spent so much time talking about attachment. Students best learn when they feel like they're safe and supported by the adults around them. So it's
Okay. So the other thing that we want to keep in mind is the part of the brain that's used the most is the strongest. And that is a concept that's really important when we're talking about behaviors and students that have experienced a lot of trauma or fear or crisis in their lives, because they do get stuck in that survival brain, or that survival brain is active much more than the learning brain. So today we're going to be talking about students that we work with that function out of that survival brain. If anybody has any comments, thoughts about the video, go ahead and type those in the chat right now. That can be a really great video to use with staff, just to start introducing trauma-informed care, helping them to see behavior through some different lenses. It's a nice short video that you can use in staff development as well. So let's talk about the why behind the behavior that we see in our classrooms, the impact of trauma on the brain. Trauma and behavior. So there's lots and lots of research on this topic. We're going to break it down today into 3 key components of trauma and behavior. So we're going to talk about brain development, attachment pathways, and triggers. And we'll dive into each of these on the next few slides. So we want to start with just a really basic understanding of brain development. I'm wondering, in general, how many, if you have not seen the Daniel Siegel hand brain model, the things that we're going to talk about is a really good summary. So if you're interested in watching that at all, you can just YouTube or do a quick search for the hand model by Dan Siegel, and it's a really good explanation. But in order to understand all of this a little bit better, we have to talk about brain development. So what we know is that the brain develops from the bottom up, and we need one part developed before we can start on the next. So what develops first is our brainstem. So this is the part that's responsible for those vital life functions, our heart rate, digestion, breathing, all of the things that we come into this world in. So a baby primarily is functioning out of the brainstem. The next part of the brain to develop is that limbic system of our brain. And this is the part of the brain that regulates your mood, your memory, attention, pleasure seeking. It's also your fear and protective response center. So anything that comes into the body, this part of the brain takes that information and translate into, is this a threat or not a threat, and responds accordingly. The last part of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that's responsible for logic, planning, language, delayed gratification, reasoning, all the things that really, I would say, signify where we want students to be in the classroom, to be successful people in general, to be able to interact with others and problem solve. That's all coming from the cortex part of the brain. So what we know is that the top part of the brain is the most changeable, meaning that we can build on those skills. So this is great news, because if students are lagging some of these skills, we can put in strategies to help them build those skills. But what we also know is that when children are exposed to trauma early during their development, it is the brain stem and the limbic part of their brain that is most impacted. And the lower brain is much harder to change. So it is changeable, but it takes a lot of practice. So for example, if I were to say to you, starting tomorrow, I need you to start tying your shoes in a different way than you tie your shoes. You would be able to do that, but it would take a lot of practice to be able to get to the point where you could do that immediately. And so when we talk about making some of these changes in how kids are responding, we just have to know that it's going to take a lot of time and practice, because when traumatic experiences have impacted kids at a young age, when their brain is developing, it takes a long time to be able to change that process. So let's talk about how trauma affects cognitive development and the developmental structures of the brain. Students who have experienced or are currently experiencing trauma or crisis can present with a variety of symptoms, which are listed on the left side of the screen. Students can withdraw or act out when something triggers a memory of the trauma, and these triggers activate that survival part of the brain. When children experience trauma, there's that release of a stress hormone. And this is true for everyone when they experience stress. We have that fight, flight, or freeze response that releases cortisol into our system. When children have experienced a lot of traumatic or stressful events, it creates an overabundance of stress hormones in the brain. And the overabundance of these hormones damages structures of the brain, and it causes children to be always in a state of alert, super hypervigilant, and always wanting to protect themselves. And as we go through some examples in the future, we'll talk about why this is really important. But as you can see, these are just some of the things that you might be seeing in students in your classroom who have experienced some different trauma pieces. Neural pathways don't develop like they should. So higher ordered thinking, parts of the brain that regulate decision-making, emotional regulation, and judgment is less developed. So when students get stuck in a place where they're hypervigilant and always looking out for threat, it causes them to have delayed development in the prefrontal cortex part of their brain where we need them to be for school. So if you think about behavior, how disruptive brain development impacts behavior, so much of the way we interact is with language. So for example, giving instructions as adults, we tend to use a lot of words, and students that are hypervigilant have a hard time processing all of these verbal instructions. We also expect that kids can make good choices. We give choices and think that they understand those choices. But if you have cognitive impairment and trouble understanding language, you're most likely going to have trouble understanding what you should be doing. So typical strategies that we might use with kids that don't have this impairment aren't as effective. The second thing that we want to look at when we're talking about brain development and behavior is this issue of attachment. At a basic level, we know that secure attachment is the foundation for future development. So much of what we have to do to be successful to interact with others is to read social cues, understand interactions between us and other people. And if you have this foundation to understand if you don't have this foundation to understand the world, you have trouble doing that. So kids have a really hard time being able to relate if they don't have this attachment. So on this slide, you can see this is what a secure attachment would look like. And this starts very early on. This is just a basic example of if you have an infant, if they have needs and those needs are met, the infant is comforted, they learn that they are valued, that people care about them. And when kids develop with a secure attachment, it's associated with greater emotional regulation, social competence, and willingness to take on challenges. However, if that doesn't happen, they can become fearful and they learn not to rely on others. So for behavior, much of what we have to do to be successful, to interact with others, if you don't trust adults, if you learn that they're not trustworthy, if you have a fear of certain people, then you can see how when we start looking at behavior, how that can have a severe impact on the way that kids are interacting, because they don't see adults as safe. They don't see them as trustworthy when they've had the specific impact of trauma. So our job is really to remember that we are always on the edge of misunderstanding behavior. With disorganized attachment, kids don't trust the adults. They don't see them as trustworthy. They often will act and reproduce relationship patterns that they see from their home environment. And so if that home environment is something of yelling and arguing, then those are the kind of patterns that we see. The great thing about a school setting, is it allows for us to make alternative interpretations of how children have seen behaviors modeled for them. So it's our opportunity to show them something different. Many behavior issues that we see are a result of not having a secure attachment, not having the role models that we want to see, and not viewing the world as being safe, trustworthy, and thinking I'm a valued person. The third thing that we want to talk about, just to get a base understanding of what's happening with students in trauma, has to do with trauma triggers. So understanding trauma triggers, there are things that remind the child of the trauma, but might not be clear to us. So if you think about your own memories or things that trigger your memories, so smells, sights, sounds, all of those things that can immediately take you back to a positive memory in your childhood. What happens with kids that have experienced trauma, when they have a traumatic history, those exact same triggers can take them back to a very scary place. And the other thing that's hard for us as adults is these triggers are often not evident to us. So it's hard for us to understand why they might be reacting in a certain way, when probably what happened is their senses were triggered to a traumatic memory. So then we start seeing people acting out in ways that don't make sense to us. One of the things that happens with trauma triggers is the survival brain is activated. So students revert back to acting as if and feeling as if the trauma is occurring here and now. It causes the brain to develop in a way that helped the child to survive when it was dangerous. But in schools, these behaviors that at one point served an adaptive function, so things that we see like running and yelling, shutting down and fighting, for a child in a traumatic environment become their automatic way of responding to stress or any type of perceived threat. Those reactions and behaviors helped a child to feel safe, but they become problematic in the school setting. We also know that when youth are triggered, their learning brain shuts off and they go into that fear and response system. So I want you to just think about, if you can think of some kids that that are maybe responding out of this survival brain, or sometimes where you've had a student that was totally fine and then there was a potential trigger, something triggered them, and you see some kind of a response that seems unreasonable to you. So I think a lot of times, if you look at the slide, some of the things that we might see are acting out, impulse control, being confused about maybe some of the ways that they acted and not remembering exactly what happened. So I want you to think of some examples of kids that you've worked with that have had exaggerated or unusual responses to some of those normal circumstances. I was just talking with Amber and Mariella before we started the training, and they were sharing an example of a student who was in the lunch line, and when the student was asked to go into a different part of the line, they had a very unusual reaction to what the adults thought would be normal. And I thought that was a really great example to show that in some way there was a trigger there, that the child went into their fight, flight, freeze response. And what we want to do is try and change our perception of how we look at these situations. And rather than thinking of them of misbehaviors, but considering that this is something that the child is doing for survival strategies for them, even though we know that it creates difficult behaviors that we see. One of the examples that I think of when I was working as a behavior interventionist, I remember I had worked with a kiddo for a long time. We had a really good relationship, and I walked into the office and this kiddo was having a major meltdown. And I walked in and he just started calling me names and, telling me to F off and all of these things. And I just remember my reaction was feeling really embarrassed. So I was triggered. But I could also see in that moment that I was being a trigger. So do I stay in that situation? Do I step out and let someone else let someone else step in, because it seemed to be escalating the situation? But what I like about this dinosaur suit is it was a really great example, an aha moment for me, because what happened with the student, he ended up getting suspended. But when he returned back to school, he came into my office, kicked his feet up, sat there, was like, hey, how's it going? And just chit-chatting like nothing had ever happened. And it really helped me to realize that in that situation, I was a trigger for him, not out of anything that I did myself. I reminded him of someone in his history, and he may or may not have totally remembered that whole situation, but him coming into my office was his way of apologizing, acknowledging that, hey, something happened, but I'm back here. And it was a good reminder not to take things personal, and that sometimes kids just react, and it doesn't feel good to them either. When they flip their lid, and they are acting out of an area of just responding and reacting, they're not being reasonable, they're not being rational. And so it's our job not to take that personally and to create a safe space for them. And then we'll work with them later when things calm down so that they can move into a place where they can try to build some skills so they can make better decisions next time. Sorry, I was just checking the chat there to see if we had any questions. So I know that's covering a lot of information, but I just wanted to review a few basic things about brain development and how it affects behavior. So I want to break it down a little bit, the things that we've been talking about. So this first picture shows, where we want students to be in that upstairs learning brain. The upstairs is responsible for delayed gratification, problem solving, access to language and reasoning. And again, that downstairs brain, that's our reactive pleasure seeking part of the brain. And also our fear and response center that is always constantly monitoring for stress. So the way that regulation should work and how our brains should work is the prefrontal cortex part of the brain should take control when there's a crisis situation, when students are in the learning brain. As we get older, our prefrontal cortex part of our brain gets stronger. So in youth, they're very much functioning more out of the limbic part of their brain, being reactive, pleasure seeking, adrenaline, all of those kinds of things. So the way that the brain should function, and our brains don't fully develop until we're, up to about 25 years of age. But for example, if I am driving down the road and somebody cuts me off, my limbic part of my brain here wants to respond by maybe yelling some vicinities, by jerking my wheel back. Maybe I want to stick my hand out the window and make some kind of signs. But the way the brain should work is that prefrontal cortex takes over, and it allows me to think about the consequences that might happen if I make those decisions. It allows me to access my coping skills so I can take a few breaths. I could call somebody to talk about how I'm feeling. I can think about what the consequences might be if I were to jam my car into the other car that just cut me off. And with all of those things, I'm able to calm my body down, calm my brain down, and make a rational decision. That's how the brain is supposed to work. But remember, we talked a little bit about the part of the brain that's used the most is the strongest. So people that have experienced a lot of crisis or fear, trauma, any of those kinds of things, their fear and response center is much bigger. So when a threat occurs, it's a lot harder for our thinking brain to kick on, and our brain stays flipped, and we function right here out of this fear response center. And the reason that I bring this up, that this is important, is because when we look at behavior and what works for kids in classrooms, sometimes this is why our normal interventions don't work. When we use things like reinforcements, and I have an example of a sticker chart up here, when a student is responding out of their survival brain, they are thinking about the here and now. They're not using their coping skills. They're not thinking about consequences in the future. And so I just want to put this out there as an example of why sometimes we can have the best plans in place. We can have the best reinforcement systems. We can have great reward systems, but they don't work in that moment. And they don't work in that moment because of the way the brain works. Our brain, our lid has flipped. We are functioning out of the here and now, and we're not thinking about future consequences. So one of the things that we need to be aware of when we're working with kids in a school environment and we're wanting to build those skills is making sure that we're not putting rewards out there that they don't have a lot of control of. So sometimes you see things like, if you can do well all week, you can go to the dance on Friday. Well, what happens with kids that have experienced trauma who are responding out of that fear and response center is when something happens, they react, and they're not thinking about the rewards that they have or that they could have in 2 days. So we need to give them opportunities to calm down, to repair when they've done something wrong, and just to give ourselves credit that just because something doesn't work in the moment doesn't mean that we should just say, you know what, our plan sucks, it's not working. It just means that in that moment, we need to think about where the child was functioning out of their brain development and put our interventions in accordingly. And one thing I like that's helpful for me to remember is we all have situations where our brain works in this way. So for example, I might set a goal to lose weight and I want to eat healthy. So I've had a long week, I'm tired, I'm hungry, I'm stressed. I come home and the last thing I want to do is eat healthy. I don't feel like eating fish and broccoli. So what do I do instead? I will go for the pizza or the chocolate cake. Why do I do that? I do that because I'm stressed, because it feels good, because I'm not thinking about the consequences. I'm living here in the here and now. Does that mean I shouldn't ever set goals for myself? Does it mean that my plan to get healthy is not worth doing, is not a good plan? No, not at all. It just means that we need to recognize where we're functioning and the behaviors that we're functioning out of in our brain, because the interventions that we use make a difference. And when we're functioning out of the stress response part of our brain, the interventions that are most useful are helping students to regulate their emotions, helping them to calm down, because when we do that, we allow that frontal cortex part of the brain to come back. And then we have access to our verbal, to our coping skills, to delayed gratification, and all of those things that we know are where we need children to be in the classroom in order to be learning. Sorry, I was just looking at the comments there to make sure I wasn't missing anything. So I know that's a lot. That was a really quick overview of a lot about the brain and attachment that we could talk about for days, but I want to stop for just a minute and see if anyone has questions before we move into our next part, which is really talking about traditional discipline versus trauma responsive practices based on where students are. So does anybody have any questions or thoughts that you want to ask or share before we move on to that next part? It's so hard to do this via Zoom because and my lights just shut off on me. Sorry, I have to stand up in just a second. Sorry. Can you turn those lights on? Thank you. Sorry, nobody knows I'm back here tucked in the corner. Okay, anybody have any questions as we move forward? The biggest thing as I come back to thinking about difficult behaviors is where are we at in brain functioning, because it makes such a difference. And as we move forward, we want to think about how do our discipline practices reflect what we know about human development and brain science. We have to have an understanding of the human brain and how we all process information through our fear response center, and that children with traumatic backgrounds tend to spend most of their time functioning out of that fear and response and reactive survival part of the brain. And we don't get cause and effective thinking in that area. Children operating from that part of the brain are not making good choices. They're reacting, they have their fight, flight, freeze response on, and the response to students in this state is co-regulation, which helps the child's brain calm down enough so that the thinking part of their brain can come back on. I really like this statement: behavior is functional, not good or bad. A lot of times as adults, we see behavior as good or bad, but the student does it because it's effective for them in one way or another. We all work with students that are struggling, whether with trauma, stress, crisis, and having an understanding of how the brain functions under stress is so important, because how we intervene should depend on which part of the brain the child is functioning out of. If it's reactive, then we need to do co-regulation. We need to get them calmed down. And it's all about providing some of those strategies. So when you hear people talking about mindfulness and deep breathing and exercising and doodling and fidget toys, which I know have their own concerns, the purpose of those activities has to do with regulation and calming that brain down. So there's a difference between whether someone is acting out deliberately in a calm state and pushing and testing boundaries. And in that case, we want to be clear and we want to set boundaries and we want to let people know what the consequences are. But most of the time in situations where things get crazy and crises occur, if you think back to those times, students are functioning out of a crisis response emotional brain. They're not being rational and reasonable. I can think of a perfect example of this where I had a student that I was working with in a high school. She was in a class and something happened in the class, but she felt like she was backed into a corner. So she started acting out and just reacting, basically responding in that situation, trying to get out of the room. But it escalated very quickly because she wasn't following directions. The school resource officer steps in. And then again, because of the traumatic experience that she has, she's functioning out of fight, flight, or freeze. So she's, trying to fight to get away. She's yelling comments. She starts making threats. And you can see how this situation just starts cycling out of control. And what we have to remember is where she's at in that part of her brain. She's not being rational. She is focusing on survival in this moment. And the interventions that she needed, unfortunately, a lot of times are not the interventions that students get when they have flipped their lid and they're being emotional. What they need is time and space. And we'll talk a little bit about what some regulation strategies are. When the brain is stressed and we're in panic mode, we're not thinking clearly. And I try to stop and think about this anytime I'm getting stressed or I see somebody in a crisis state. But I think it can be really helpful for us to think of personal examples where maybe we have flipped our own lid. There's a few examples that I like to use. This summer, we were out in a lake and I was floating on an inner tube and I could see a gardener snake, so small gardener snake, but still kind of gives me chills. It was in the water swimming towards my friend and I could see it coming. So I just said to my friend, I was, hey, you might want to lift your feet up. There's a gardener snake coming this way. As I said that, she jumps off of her inner tube into the water where the snake is and starts screaming. And I just remember thinking, like, that is about the most irrational thing I can think of in that moment. But that is a prime example of the way our brain works under stress and trauma. We are not thinking rationally. We are just reacting and we are responding. So it doesn't do me any good in that moment to say, hey, now you're in the water with the snake. Like, what in the world were you thinking? Because that's not helpful. So thinking about your own situations where maybe you have had where stress came in and you flipped your lid and you weren't thinking clearly can be really helpful in reminding you in moments on how to step back, not take things personally with students, and help them be able to calm down and get back to that rational mind where we can start helping them to calm down and then ultimately practice and change some of those behaviors. This quote really captures that trauma-informed thinking about misbehavior. When you have a student that's struggling and isn't doing well, this is really what we remember. Children do well if they possess the skills they need, and if their unresolved problems are addressed. So when a student misbehaves, our goal is to really figure out what is happening underneath. And sometimes we don't get to know the specifics, but if we at least can be aware enough of brain development, we can know which interventions we need to use in that moment. And we really want to start shifting from a blame, shame, punishment approach to one that is taking care of kids so that they feel safe and they're in an environment where they can learn. So to reach that learning brain, what we know from research is that there's a process that works to help us do this. Regulate, relate, and reason. This is the process from moving from the bottom, which is that primitive brainstem, to the top in order where we get the prefrontal cortex back to thinking. So no matter what the reason is why a dysregulated brain state can occur, we don't want to be disciplining someone or labeling their behavior as something that it's not, when really it's probably a reaction and we need to help them calm down. So our first goal is to recognize the underlying problem when students are acting out or shutting down, and to intervene by helping them to be emotionally present. We are working on trying to get that thinking brain to come back, and we do that through step one of regulate, relate, and reason. We are helping them to regulate. If you think back to the survival brain in the video, the brain is highly reactive and on constant alert for danger. And it even perceives neutral situations as dangerous. So our job is to really quiet that stress response system and lower that state of hypervigilance so that students can move back into that learning brain that we need them to be successful in the classroom. So the important thing to know about regulation is that a child's regulation is dependent on the adult's modeling and what they have learned. So taking care of yourself is the most important thing, because self-regulation is key. If an adult is angry or frustrated or stressed, A child cannot be in a calm and peaceful state. It's just the way our brain works. If we feel stress and anger and resentment and sarcasm, we are much more likely to respond in our fight, flight, or freeze. And for kids that have experienced trauma, they have a heightened awareness of this, so they can even perceive neutral situations as dangerous. So there are things we need to do to take an extra step to make sure that they feel safe, that they're in a predictable environment, so that they're not perceiving a neutral situation as dangerous. What we really want to do in regulation as adults is our job is to be their prefrontal cortex, and we want to allow students to borrow our stress response system. We want to keep a calm and relaxed posture, provide space. There are things we can do specifically with our body language, with our tone of voice, with the words that we use. But our job is to help people feel safe so that they can move out of the stress mode and into a process of learning again. And this can feel really overwhelming, but really it comes down to just basic things of taking care of yourself. If you are in a state where you are modeling self-care and checking in with yourself and taking a break when you need to, all of the things that are just really healthy when we're feeling stressed and anxious, students learn from those behaviors. I love this quote here on the slide. When little people are overwhelmed by big emotions, it's our job to share our calm, not join their chaos. And I feel like a lot of times in our culture, we do that backwards. When it's chaotic, we jump in, we add to the chaos instead of focusing on how can we help the student to calm down in this moment so that we can teach them some skills. Another thing about when your brain is perceiving that it's a crisis situation, you're in that survival brain, your brain responds quickest to nurturing touch. But since touch is often not recommended because we don't know, what kind of stress and trauma students have unless there's a relationship there. The other thing that can be most useful in helping someone to calm down is using a soft, slow tone of voice. It's one of the most reliable ways to establish safety and to help us slow down and calm our nervous system. And I have used this several times in working in crisis. I noticed that if I slow my words down, I change my body posture stance so that it's not interpreted as potentially dangerous. You have to watch things like making eye contact and staring. Someone could perceive that as a threat. What is your posture over the student? Are you standing over them with your arms crossed? Or do you have an open stance and a nice soft voice? Those are all things that help to just calm the way our body responds. Also practicing things like deep breathing, mindfulness. Those are all really great strategies that we can use to help teach emotional regulation to students. So one of the things I want to ask you, just because co-regulation is so important, is I'm going to use this analogy of you're holding a cup of coffee when someone comes along and bumps into you or shakes your arm, making you spill your coffee everywhere. I want to ask you, and I want you to respond in the chat, why did you spill your coffee? No wrong answers. Why did you spill your coffee? I was drinking it while walking. Love it. So those are the answers that we hear a lot. Because someone bumped into me, I spilled my coffee. But what I want you to think about is you spilled the coffee because coffee was in your cup. Had there been tea in your cup, you would spill the tea. So the purpose of this analogy is that whatever is inside of your cup is what's going to spill out. So as adults, we need to think about when life comes along and shakes you, which will happen. And with these kiddos, a lot of times they know how to push your buttons, they know how to get you rattled. So we have to ask ourselves, what is in our cup when life gets tough? What is going to spill over? Frustration, anger, irritability, or is it joyfulness, gratefulness, peace, humility? So we have to learn to take an inventory of where we're at as well, because it is so important in being able to support students and help them. Because if we're not in a place then of being able to help someone else, then we're not going to be able to work with students. And that emotional contagion, it's contagious what we're feeling. So taking some time to check in with ourselves, and then also being aware enough to know that we sometimes we're the trigger, sometimes we aren't in an emotional space where we can do that, and then using our team when we need to. So is this a time that I need to have someone else step in because I just can't do it in this moment? I had a rough morning. I have been triggered all morning. Somebody else needs to deal with this kid this morning because I am not going to be very helpful. Or can I stop, do some things to get myself calm and regulated before I do an intervention in that case? So just something to think about where you're at and working with kids. Here's some examples of regulation strategies. There's all kinds of them, but really when we think about regulation, we're thinking about the brainstem. And what calms the brainstem, we want to think about things that calm or soothe a baby. So repetitiveness, soothing, reducing stimuli, those are all things that help calm the brainstem. We also want to check in with basic needs. Is somebody hungry? Are they thirsty? When you are constantly in that fear and response stress cycle, it pulls energy and hormones from your body, making you feel thirsty, making your stomach hurt. There's all of these somatic complaints that come along with being under a constant threat and sense of fear. The other thing that can be super helpful with regulation strategies, anything that uses both sides of the brain. So if you can allow a student to pass something from one side of their hand to another, or take a walk down to the drinking fountain, those are all strategies that help to calm the brain down so that that learning brain comes back into process and they're not just functioning out of their fear and response center. And I will give you lots of examples of regulation activities in the Google Drive that we'll share with you. So the next step is, so we have regulate and we have relate. So the next thing that we need to do is build relationships with kids. Building relationships is the most evidence-based strategy intervention that we can do. I think the key here, though, is that we're talking about creating an actual experience of attunement and a trusting, strong relationship so that kids feel attached. They know that you care about them. When there's a true interaction, which research says only takes 15 seconds, if you're truly attuned, you truly care, and you make someone feel good about themselves, your body releases oxytocin, which causes them to feel better. So that's why things like sarcasm, they don't work. Kids can tell when you don't like them. They can tell when you're not being genuine. So I have had to do this with my own kids. Set down my cell phone, look them in the eyes, listen to what they're saying. Those things can be very important because relationships make a difference. And we get to know kids. We know what's happening in their lives. We can help them identify maybe what some of their triggers and behavior patterns are, but building that relationship is the most important thing that we can do. Some things to remember with that: we need to know our own triggers so that if we are getting agitated and upset, we need to be willing to step out. We want to lead by example, which we've talked about a little bit. Where in our classroom, in our setting, how can we promote regulation strategies? I like to do what I call reset moments, where I can say, you know what, I'm feeling really stressed. I just need a reset. Whoever wants to do it with me, you're welcome to. Or you start your morning with some deep breathing. You allow students to share different things that they use to help them feel in control and to calm down, and just really providing space to talk about feelings, to talk about things they do to feel better, and promoting that kind of conversation and setting that example. And then the last part is just really that not getting sucked in, not taking it personal, recognizing that behavior is communication, it's serving a purpose. So what are we seeing? What is it that that student is needing in this moment, and how can we help them to meet that need? And that can get really complicated in behaviors, because you can have two students do the same behavior, and the intervention for that behavior needs to look different, because the function of that behavior is different. So we have to understand, why are they doing this? What need are they trying to get met? And step back and think about that instead of just reacting to some of the behaviors that we see. That is how we get to the root of what's underneath those behaviors. The last part is reasoning. What's really important, I have no issue with consequences, but timing makes a difference. So we need to think about where kids are at in the moment. And there are different strategies that we can use at each phase. So we want to use what we've learned today to look at their behavior from a different perspective and decode that behavior to navigate these crisis situations. So timing of the intervention is really important. How you respond should depend on where the child is in their brain, and also in this acting out cycle. If a student is at the height of an outburst, so that very peak, we know that reasoning won't work. Why do we know that? Because we understand how their brain works. They don't have access to language and their coping skills in that moment. Our job is to help them calm down and regulate, so that we can get to that point of 7 in recovery, where we can look back at the situation and we can problem solve and help them learn new skills that they can use. So in the calm phase, that's where we want to practice. We want to create environments that are predictable, that are safe, that help kids understand and get that safe feeling. In the trigger state, we want to be alert to signs that the child is becoming upset, and so that we can anticipate some of those things, or maybe try and anticipate possible triggers in the future. When they start to get agitated, our job is to use some of those strategies. So we're trying to put in those regulation strategies so that we don't have a full-blown behavioral incident. So distractions, breaks, any of those tools that we have, that's what we want to use in that agitation phase. In acceleration and peak, our job is really safety here. How do we get the student into a space where they're not hurting themselves, they're not hurting others? Our main goal is safety. And then for de-escalation, we want strategies for regulation and calming the brain. One of the things I think we get wrong a lot in the school setting is we start to talk the recovery process when a student is still in the peak phase of their behavior. So how do we know if we are putting in and talking about consequences too soon? We know because the students will tell us. If they have started calming down and we start talking to them about consequences and making better choices, and we see that agitation amping back up, that's our cue that they are not ready to handle that yet. Sometimes it's 5 minutes, sometimes it's 30, sometimes it needs to be the next day. There is no problem with consequences. It's just that we know enough to know that we cannot have that meaningful conversation with students until they're in the learning brain and they can think about it and have a rational conversation with us. So we want to make sure that we know where they're at in this cycle. This is just a review of some of the things that we talked about. We want to stay grounded and get regulated, watch our body language, regulate, relate, and reason. It makes a difference in how we interact. I have a short video clip that just shows how some schools have done this in a successful way with adults. I'm going to show that. And then if there's any questions, I will be here for questions.
I appreciate y'all coming and have a conversation. There's a lot we do within the building to create spaces that are conducive for de-escalation. Kids are able to remove themselves from a negative situation, process what has caused the crisis, and make different choices about how to move forward.
Sometimes it's not the easiest thing in the world to tell a kid, you know, I know all this is happening to you, I know all of this is going on, but I want you to learn. And so we are giving them a space and a context to process some of that emotion, to de-escalate, and then transition back to class.
Many of our classrooms have what we call de-escalation spaces. So there'll be a beanbag in the corner or a curtain that allows you to step away, just something that creates a little bit of separation for kids that the teacher recognizes need that, or the student.
Students come to me, I greet them, and then I just give them alone time. And because they don't associate the space necessarily with academics, it's easier for them to utilize it outside of the classroom and recognize it as a safe space. For myself, when my emotions are high, it's best to calm down before I begin to try to communicate.
It's giving us the time to cool down, do the coloring. It gives me an opportunity to be like, okay, yeah, taking this breath, I can talk now without trying to cry. Just letting us do that makes it better.
So then they'll begin to kind of share and open up about really what's bothering them. How was that?
It wasn't good.
We really try to teach our kids how to be resilient, how to utilize resources, and take care of themselves.
We have another space where our counselor is located.
All right, so you go talk first, and when you get done, you go talk, okay?
Who does real-time conflict resolution.
I didn't want to tell you who to hang with.
We can't expect people to just get along. We have to show them what getting along looks like.
You have an issue with a teacher, with another student, and they come in my room, and we have a conversation like, hey, what happened? Today I had two students. They've been friends for about 2 or 3 years. They had a big old fight with another boy, and we stopped them from outside and brought them in. Yeah, both strong young men.
What is going to happen is knowing how I contributed to the conflict, right? And how to respond to you with empathy.
I wasn't solving it out the right way, so I should have communicated better.
We come to the table and say, hey, it ain't about you. It's about respecting each other.
Hey. Well, I so appreciate your time today. I know everyone has so much on their plate. I just challenge you, I guess, to think of one thing that you might be able to use from this presentation that you can implement in your personal life, in your work life. And really one of the biggest takeaways is just recognizing where kids are. Is it an emotional response or a deliberate response, and making sure that our interventions are appropriate to that mindset. So I will stick around for questions. I know we're right here at the end, so I'm available as long as you need. So if you have any questions, feel free to unmute or type those in the chat, and I will get our resources and this PowerPoint uploaded into the Google link.
Thank you so much, Tara. I'm going to launch the poll real quick if people are still on, if they could take a quick second to complete that. And I put the link for the Google Drive in the chat as well for people to access that. But again, we will have all of those resources on the website, hopefully in the next week, along with this recording. So thank you again all for your time and coming today. And thank you, Tara, for sharing your knowledge and information. I appreciate it.